How are y'all doing? How are y'all doing? There we go. Yeah. This is an exciting moment, so you got to get hyped up because there's a strike wave in the United States. So what I'm going to try to do is two things. First is get you as excited as possible about what we are experiencing with the Teachers' Rebellion, and then the second is to draw out four of the big lessons from that for organizers in general and for public education teachers and activists specifically. So I used to be a teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so I'm going to subject you to some of my teacherly ways. So I have some visuals. For those of you who sat in the back of the class, you reap what you sow now, because so I'll describe it if you can't see. This is a graph that shows the number of educators that went on strike in 2018. And so for those who can't see it, it's just this dramatic increase, by far the largest increase and largest number of educators on strike in the history of the United States. Almost 400,000 educators struck in 2018 alone. That doesn't, not even including the recent strikes we've seen in 2019 in Los Angeles, Denver, Oakland. So this is a really unprecedented political and historical development, and it's something we should be really excited about. The next graph is the average size of the strikes. And this is interesting because a lot of people haven't realized this statistic, which is the average size of the strikes in 2018 were by far the largest in the history of the United States. So this graph goes back to 1945, but you see a dramatic increase in 2018. Does anyone here want to wager a guess of why the strikes were so large in 2018? Well, what specifically about them made them so much bigger than really any other part of U.S. history?
I think there were statewide strikes, and then secondly, there were as many smaller strikes.
Yes, so for those who couldn't hear, these were statewide strikes. I have a plant in the audience to answer all the questions and avoid awkward silences, so good job. So these were overwhelmingly statewide strikes. It started in West Virginia, then spread to Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky, Colorado, North Carolina. So unlike most strikes, these were massively big. And so we're talking about hundreds of thousands of educators who struck, and for each one of those educators, dozens of students and family members. And so really you're talking about millions of people participated in these strikes because they were strikes not just of teachers, but of all school workers, and not just of school workers, but really of the communities connected to the schools as a whole. So this is a really big deal. The last graph I will show you is the total number of strikers in 2018 and going back to a few decades. And so you can see, again, a very significant increase. And what's interesting about this graph is it breaks it down by industry. So you can see the red here is manufacturing as the percentage of strikes. And so you can see a pretty dramatic decline. And you can see at the same time a very big increase in purple, which is the number of educators that struck as a percentage of the total. And the thing I want to draw your attention to here, it's just worth thinking about, is this gray area, which is the non-teachers that struck in 2018, because there was two other industries that struck in large numbers other than education. And it's just worth thinking about some of the similarities between that and education. So does anyone know that two industries that struck in 2018 other than education in significant numbers? There was some walkouts, but not actually in large numbers. There were some walkouts, but this were not the two I was looking for. Yes?
Nurses and hotel workers.
Nurses and hotel workers. Smart audience. Yes, nurses and hotel workers. Yeah, so you have education, hotels, healthcare as the three sectors. And you can think about some of the structural similarities of these industries and why people are striking there. To my mind, the single most important commonality of these three industries is that they're overwhelmingly female workforces. And so you have a strike wave and a labor movement right now that's led by women workers, and I think that's amazing, and we should just sort of foreground that. And it's a big part of what's so inspiring about what we're witnessing. So those are some numbers. I've got two more visuals for you in a second, but I think if we think about the transformation that we're witnessing in the United States, part of that transformation is that the strikes have changed the political common sense on a variety of issues. One of them is it's put the strike back on the table for the labor movement, right? Because for 4 decades, if not longer, unions unfortunately have been extremely reticent at best, that's my nice way of saying this, to strike. because largely it's been the labor movement's focused on trying to lobby the Democratic Party, and that's gotten us into the current impasse that we're in. But for the first time in a very long time, the strike is back on the table. People saw it worked. People saw the victories that were won, and we're talking about major victories. Huge pay increases, 20% pay increase in a place like West Virginia, or in Arizona rather. In Oklahoma, they got the first tax increase in 20 years to pay for more funding and better pay for educators, beating back some of the worst attacks on healthcare and privatization. So these are these are big wins. And when people see these wins, it inspires others. And so right now it's mostly in education that people are striking, but there is this potential for it to spread. I'm not sure if people remember how the federal government shutdown ended, but when the Pelosi and the Democrats were unable to do anything to stop Trump's federal government shutdown, it's just going on and on. And what ended it was because air traffic controllers called in sick that Friday, and the flight attendants threatened to strike the next day. Right? And Sarah Nelson, who's the president of the flight attendants, when they, give some clapping, come on, this is good. It's actually true, we take this stuff for granted now. History is moving very quick, so we're like, oh yeah, I'll walk out, stand a government shutdown, cool, whatever, move on. But no, this is a really big deal. And so when they interviewed Sarah Nelson about, where did you come up with this idea, strike to end the federal government shutdown, her answer was, well, if the teachers are striking, why can't we? Right? And so there's this idea, if the teachers are striking, why can't we, is a very powerful and very dangerous, if you're the billionaire class, idea to spread. So the strike is back on the table. That's one big transformation. The second is that the strikes have changed the common sense around public education in this country, right? Because until very recently, what we were told about the crisis of our schools is that it's the fault of greedy teachers, obstructionist unions, and basically the inherent inefficiencies of the public sector. So you had to bring in charter schools, privatization, standardized testings to fix the supposed problems. And these are my last visuals I'll show you. This, to give you a sense of it, these are Time magazine covers. This is 2008, 2014. Does anyone here in front, anyone know who this person, this lovely human being is? Anybody? Michelle Rhee. Who's Michelle Rhee, for those who don't know?
The notorious education reform lobbyist for Washington, D.C.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, she's like privatizer-in-chief of the Washington, D.C. schools. So according to Time magazine, that's how to fix America's schools. And then here, 2014, rotten apples. It's nearly impossible to fire a bad teacher. Some tech millionaires may have found a way to change that. So, this is the discourse up until very recently. So presumably the millionaires are going to fix our schools for us. And that changed because the strikes radically shifted the way people were talking about the schools, and they changed the common sense about really what is at the root of the problems of the schools. So much so that this was the most recent Time education cover. Some of you might have seen it. I have a master's degree, 16 years of experience, work 2 extra jobs, and donate blood plasma to pay the bills. I am a teacher in America, right? And so because of the strikes, which were overwhelmingly supported in all of the states, and nationally the last poll had 78% of the public supported the teacher strikes and their demands, which is just bonkers. These are astronomically high numbers. And so because of that, this is the new way we're talking about schools, which is that the reason schools are problems that they are is that they're underfunded, that teachers are underpaid, so we're not able to keep good quality teachers. And so the solution is giving teachers a fair salary, funding the schools, ending the racial inequities that are to continue to plague the school system. And that is a huge win because we've won the public argument. Now we have to win the political battle to force that policy change, because that is just still beginning. That hasn't been won fully yet, despite the important victories of the strike. But the fact is we're winning, and that wouldn't have happened without the strikes. And so the last transformation I'll mention before getting into some of the political lessons of the strike is, I think the most moving aspect of the strikes that I witnessed, because I was on the ground covering them and building national solidarity, was the transformation of the people themselves who went through the strike. How many people here have ever been on strike, just to get a sense? Okay, so I will describe it very briefly. When I asked educators on the picket line or afterwards, to try to just, paint a picture of what it felt like, they were almost at a loss for words to describe just how much their lives felt different, how they felt different as an individual. The metaphors that people resorted to were almost religious. I mean, this was the main thing. There was almost like a awakening. For the first time, people felt like they felt part of a community. They felt that they had a sense of power. They felt like they had people listening to them, and that they had dignity and respect finally, after being sort of marginalized and really maligned by the politicians at large. And so people went through this amazing transformative process of getting a sense of their own power, and that's a very hard thing to put back in the box afterwards. Once people get a sense that they can change the world, they don't want to go back to the way it was before. And that's really inspiring, because it means that people are going to keep on fighting, and they're going to keep on trying to lean on that power that they saw that they had. And so the question then for us, and I think it's very exciting to do this event in Columbus, because I know that the teachers union is organizing and mobilizing, and we'll hear about that in a second, but it's worth thinking through them. What are the big political lessons from these walkouts that we might be able to generalize? And so I'm just going to touch on 4 relatively briefly to help spark some political discussion. The first is, overwhelmingly, these were strikes that were fought not just for the people who went on strike themselves, but really for the working people as a whole. So there were a lot of demands for better pay, but it was never just about pay. It was always about more funding for schools, against privatization, for anti-racist demands, like in Los Angeles. If you look, the Los Angeles strike won an end to racial profiling in the schools, and then to random searches of Black and Muslim students. They won an immigration detention fund, so that for families who were facing ICE, that the district would actually pay their lawyer fees, right? And so they won all sorts of demands like this that were able to make it clear to the public at large that teachers weren't just greedy, but in fact they were fighting for better public education, better lives for the vast majority of people in their states. And that was critical, because a public sector strike in particular, you ride or die based on if you have public support. If you have that public support, then the politicians are going to cave, but if you don't have that public support, then it's very hard to win your demands. And so overwhelmingly, the teachers and the school workers forged an alliance with the community by raising very broad demands on behalf of everybody. So that's the first lesson. It's worth thinking through for any of us who want to build a labor movement back to the way it should be. The second big lesson is that the strikes, for the most part, had to break the law. And that's important, because it's not just red states where you don't have the right to strike. This is sort of a misnomer. Like, I live in New York. Public sector workers don't have the right to strike in New York. Only 13 states in our country do public sector workers have the right to strike. And in the private sector, technically they have the right, but there's so many restrictions that in practice it's almost impossible for most workers at most times to legally strike. So what we're talking about then is a labor movement that's been hampered by one of the most anti-democratic labor law systems in the capitalist world. And so it's poses this question: how do you fight back and win then, when your main weapon, because our main weapon as working people is our ability to withhold our labor, to force management to listen to us? What do you do when that right is taken from you? And in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona, it was not easy for people to strike. I think it would be a real mistake to think that people just sort of recklessly decided to strike. In fact, people were terrified. And there was really, because you can imagine, the Republican politicians and some of the Democrats as well were threatening teachers with getting fired if they struck, right? And so if your family depends on your wage to pay rent, have food on the table the next day, you're gonna think twice before taking an action that could literally risk the survival of your family. So, folks were really terrified from this scaremongering. But ultimately in the process of months and of organizing, organizers were able to make the case to folks that, look, if we all go out together, they're not going to be able to come after us all, right? If we all go out together, do you really think they're going to fire us all? They can barely hire enough teachers as it is right now to fill the classrooms, right? And so this argument that if we all go out together, they're not going to be able to retaliate, won the day, and it in fact ended up being proven in practice, because the Republicans who were making all of these threats didn't end up acting on them. And when I did interviews with the attorney generals statewide of why did you make all these threats if you didn't act on them? They said, well, to be honest, we saw what was going on, and we were worried that if we threw teachers in prison or started firing some of them, it would actually backfire on us, and it would raise the support for the strike, and it would potentially raise the threat that other workers were going to go on strike. And they were very honest about this. So it raises the question then for us as a whole, as a labor movement, that if we're going to win, we're going to have to bring back the strike, and in a lot of contexts, that's going to mean breaking the law. Okay, so that's the second lesson. The third is it took a lot of organizing to make these strikes happen. I'm not sure if you remember when the media started talking about West Virginia and elsewhere, they portrayed it almost as like spontaneous rebellions. You know, it's just like, pay was bad, teachers have risen up, wow, right? And I think that, it actually can be kind of disempowering when you see that, and that's the story, because then you look around and you're like, why aren't people rising up here, right? It's true, and what that story misses is that it actually took months of organizing in all of the states to make these mobilizations and strikes happen. And so just to give the anecdote of West Virginia, where it really all started, the initial organizing that ended up culminating in the strike began in the summer of 2017, so it's like 8 months before the strike, with a study group of Democratic Socialists of America in Charleston. A round of applause for DSA for existing. There were two organizers, Emily Comer and Jay O'Neill, who ended up getting on the Times 100 list. I don't know if anyone saw this. It's amazing. Crazy times that we live in. So these two DSA members did a study group in Charleston of Jane McAlevy's book, No Shortcuts, which is a great book, highly recommend it. And they tried, to the best of their abilities, to use this kind of power-building technique and strategy to push their unions to strike. And they were eventually successful. And it was hard because they didn't lead their unions, but so they did one-on-one organizing with their coworkers. They got people to wear red on the same day. They created a Facebook statewide group. You know, I used to be very skeptical of social media, but now I'm a firm believer in the power of memes. You know, that it works, I gotta say. And so they did a lot of this organizing and mobilizing that eventually forced their union, which was really quite hesitant to even talk about strikes, to do the right thing and to take their action, and then to continue the strike when the union, as you might recall, stopped it halfway through. And so it was this type of organizing from below, from rank and file workers, that really made the strikes possible. And I would say if you want to look at the best organized strike, the one we should look to is actually Los Angeles, which had 4 years of preparation, and again was kind of built on the organizing models laid out in Jane McAlevy's book, in which you do deep organizing of your coworkers, school site by school site, to build up power through a systematic series of like escalating actions. And they did it so well that I think it's really our duty as organizers to look at how they built power, because if we want to do the same thing, we need to see what works and try to replicate that insofar as it's possible. And then the last big lesson that I would highlight is the strikes at their most successful, and here I'm thinking of West Virginia and LA in particular, did something very important, and they challenged this idea that there's not enough to go around, right? Because this idea, this scarcity narrative, is really prevalent. In most of the states, it wasn't the case that the Republicans were like, teachers, you suck, students, you suck, we don't like you, we're not gonna give you anything. Their response was, we love teachers, we love students, we would love to give you everything, but have you looked at the budget? There's just no money. We're really sorry. Please go back to work. And in that context, it was essential for unions and for the rank and file organizers to say, no, that's BS. That's literally not true. There's more than enough money to have quality public education for every single person in this state. But in order to make that happen, we're gonna have to do one thing, and that's gonna make the billionaires and the corporations pay their fair share. And the reason we don't have the schools that we need right now is because for decades, both Democrats and Republicans have been giving tax breaks to the rich and the corporations, and that's why we don't have the schools our students need. And they said that over and over again. And they had numbers to back it up. They did real research, and they were able to show exactly the number of cuts that have happened from these tax breaks and what kind of change in priorities was going to be necessary to be able to meet not just their demands in that strike, but really to systematically transform the public school system to provide amazing quality for all working people in the state. And they won that argument, so much so that in Los Angeles, when you were on the picket line, it wasn't just the teachers, let alone the union organizers, who could cite you these numbers about the budget cuts and the tax, and the taxes and what would need to win the schools. You could talk to students, high school students, or parents who'd be able to cite you these exact numbers of exactly what it was going to take to create the schools they needed. And so it's that kind of research and then organizing by saying make the rich pay that I think ultimately is going to be necessary if we're going to beat back the billionaires. And we need to just say we have more than enough, not just for education, but for healthcare, for a Green New Deal, for really all of the basic necessities in this country and the world. There's more than enough to go around, but that's going to take a real fight against the billionaires that run this society. And so that was the ultimate message of the strikes that I think that we're going to have to kind of generalize outwards. So to conclude, just take a step back, think about the amazing and scary moment we live in, Because on the one hand, it's terrifying. You know, Trump, climate change, the rise of the racist right, you know, all of this stuff that we think about a lot. On the other hand, I think what makes this moment different in some ways is that people really are fighting back by the millions. It's very significant that millions of working people participated in these strikes in this last year. That's something we haven't seen in literally 4 decades, and we should understand the historic significance of that. Because sometimes when you live through history, you don't actually fully witness, you don't fully recognize the depth of the changes that you're seeing. So you have that strike wave, you have the growth of the rebirth of a socialist movement for the first time in generations. The fact that DSA has 60,000 members and played a leading role in West Virginia and Arizona is a big deal, because the socialist movement historically has been at the fore of fighting for the labor movement and for oppressed groups across the country. And you have these two things, strike wave, DSA, plus now a third factor, which is you have the possibility of electing a democratic socialist to president of the United States, which is just like bonkers amazing. I'm not talking about Elizabeth Warren's Bernie Sanders. And the combination of these 3 things means that for the first time in a very long time, we have the possibilities to rebuild a mass workers' movement in the United States that can fight back and win. And I'm extremely excited about that. I hope you are too. And I think that if you ever feel like a lack of confidence about our ability and people's desire to fight back, just look at the red states again. Look at a place like Arizona. If you had expected one place in the country for there not to be a successful statewide strike, I would have said it's probably Arizona's my top 3, or Oklahoma, right? But the fact that they fought back and won and were able to generalize this protest means that I think working people are really looking for an alternative. They're angry, and it's our responsibility as organizers to provide that alternative. And we need to have confidence that when we do, massive change can happen. And I think that all of you have a big role to play in that. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for coming out.